Now, the case of national multidimensional poverty measures. And three of us will be presenting 4 national cases, and at the end we will have some questions and participations from you. Although, if you would like to interrupt us at any point, please do feel free to do so. But please also keep your comments brief because we have lots of measures to cover in a short span of time. So as we saw in the presentation of the global MPI, having internationally comparable measures is very useful in terms of being able to compare regions, subnational regions, and changes over time. We can track progress globally, and we can also do measures for acute and moderate poverty. But there was a question in the audience on whether there is actually national ownership, or whether these international measures represent what is poverty at local level. So we also have engaged into context-specific national multidimensional poverty indexes, which reflect local context and priorities, and can be used for guiding policies locally. But unfortunately, they cannot be used for an international comparison. So both of these tools are useful. And along this presentation, please remember all the steps that Sabina has presented in our last session about the decision making that you have to bear in mind behind every multidimensional poverty index. The purpose, the unit of analysis, the selection of dimensions, indicators, and deprivations cutoffs, the selection of weights, and the poverty cutoff. And we will, well, in OFI, we have been working with the governments of Colombia, Mexico, Bhutan, Chile, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Tunisia, Pakistan, Vietnam, and some other governments to define their own national measures. These slides are adapted from a presentation of Coneval, which is the institution that measures the multidimensional poverty in Mexico, and Enrique González Tiburcio. Both contents can be downloaded from Coneval and MPPN websites. The process of developing the Mexican multidimensional poverty index was a long process. It lasted around 9 years, since the year 2000, when the first negotiations to create a general law of the social development started in the Congress. But finally, they passed the law in 2004, in which the legislators, let's say it crudely, obliged the executive government to measure poverty multidimensionally. And I remember interviewing one of the actors and saying, well, we now have to implement in the executive what the legislators told us to do. So it took them another 5 years to develop guidelines and gather the data. And after 9 years, in 2009, the first results were published. You can see, well, you will compare with other case studies, and this was by far the longest process. The unit of analysis is the individual, and an old survey was modified to get all the data needed. This old survey was actually the one that was used for measuring income, and hence income poverty. And how the Mexican government defines a multidimensional poverty? Well, there are 2 aspects that they regard as basic. So a person is multidimensionally poor if he or she doesn't have sufficient income to buy a very basic basket of food and non-food items. So income is on the vertical axis of this graph, and if he or she experiences one or more deprivations defined in social rights. So as you can see implicitly, there is a 50% weight in the dimension of income, and the rest of the weight is divided in between 6 social rights. And the social rights are based in the constitutional rights. So these are access to education, to health services, to social security, the quality of the housing and the basic services that they have, and access to food. They also have a more extreme measure of poverty, in which the population that are below a more extreme poverty line and that is suffering at the same time 3 or more deprivations in social rights are defined as in being in extreme multidimensional poverty. And there are some people that are vulnerable to poverty because of social deprivations, because they experience some deprivations, but they are above the income cutoff. So this is the white rectangle on the top left corner. And there are people that are vulnerable to poverty in terms of income because they do not experience any deprivation in social rights, but are below the income poverty line. And the green rectangle represents the nirvana case, when no deprivation is experienced. Now, how they determine specific thresholds? In the case of the income dimension of economic well-being, the more extreme poverty line is based on an assessment of a food basket that considers caloric intake, and that it changes for rural and urban settings. So it's the most extreme poverty line. And then a slightly higher poverty line includes some non-food items that they consider essential, that are goods or services that have income elasticity lower than 1. That means that you tend to consume less as your income increases, and it's different for urban and rural settings as well. In the case of the 6 social rights, let's go one by one. For the educational gap, it was very interesting to see how they divided the population first into 3 groups. The first group, population age 3 to 15 years old, in which they asked whether they are attending school or they had completed the educational level based on the law. And for the next group of people, they further divide 16 years or older into 2 categories. Ones that were born before 1982, in which the prevalent level of education was primary. So for instance, I was born in 1981, and my deprivation in terms of education would be assessed against primary level. But my brother was born in 1982, and a change in the constitution led to assess secondary education as important, and his deprivation score is assessed against this change in the constitution, so he should be complying with secondary education, otherwise he would be deprived. In terms of access to health services, it is important to remember that a person is deprived if she or he has not access to any of the public or private means of getting health services. When we see access to social security, we understand, again, 3 different groups of people in the population. Those who are employed by someone, they should be given the social protection that the law demands from the employer. Those who are non-employed, non-wage employed, or voluntarily employed should have a social protection either by indirectly or voluntarily signing up for a social protection, or by kinship. Someone in the household has a social protection and comprises them. And those that are pension, that that have retired from the economic activity should receive any type of pension, otherwise they would be deprived. In terms of access to basic services, they consider 3 of them: access to piped water, access to drainage service, either connected to the network or to septic falls and septic tank, and whether the household has electricity or considers cooking fuel, solid cooking fuels. And finally, the quality of living is assessed on having either the 3 of them: roof, walls, and floors that are firm, that are not made of earth or non-existent, and whether the household has 2.5 members or less living per room in the household, not considering kitchen or toilets. Access to food security was as well defined, asking every person in the household whether they have passed in the past 3 months they have spent they have to skip 1 meal by monetary reasons or eat less than what they judged it was appropriate. So after now almost 5 years of results, or more than 5 years of results in terms of multidimensional poverty, they have seen that the headcount ratio has increased slightly, but it has increased overall nationally. Because of the properties of the index, they can decompose this into the income dimension and the social rights dimension. And they saw that while the headcount ratio of population below the extreme income poverty line increased in the period, the population experiencing 1 or more social deprivations actually decreased. This made them aware that the prices of the food basket experienced the results of inflation among food prices in Mexico, and this is why many people became income poor, although not being deprived in social rights, and this led to an increase in multidimensional poverty. This also allowed them to draw some policies and set the Cruzada Nacional contra el Hambre, the National Action Against Hunger, in which they target specifically, they gather information on all the aspects of the index, but they target those that are living on extreme multidimensional poverty, and also that are experiencing this one of the social deprivations in which access to food is limited. Now I would like to spend some minutes in the case of Bhutan, because the context is it's quite different, and I will recall some of the examples that Sabina presented in her last session. It develops based on the multidimensional gross national happiness index. It has 9 domains and 33 indicators, and it was updated in 2015. It also, the surveys also provide official consumption-based poverty estimates in 2003, 2007, and 2012. But the purpose of this measure, instead of being justified as constitutional rights based on, and basically a human rights approach, as in the case of Mexico, the motivation is that recognizing that poverty, like well-being, is multidimensional. So this implicitly changes some normative decisions. So for instance, both measures could be used obviously for targeting the poor or as a yardstick measure to of progress, but instead of including income inside the measure, income is seen as a complementary or supplementary poverty measure to this index. So income is not part of this index, We can also compare districts and results and draw conclusions for poverty. For policy purposes. The unit of analysis is not the individual; it is the household. And as you can see, one of the justifications for choosing the household is that most of the policies actually select households and work with households instead of working with individuals. In the case of Mexico, because it was a human rights approach, each individual has own intrinsic rights that have to be fulfilled. And this was also very interesting when we look at the I'll raise this point again when we look at the indicators. The data source is the Bhutanese Living Standard Survey of 2012, but they were able to harmonize observations in 2007 and 2010 to get a whole series of changes across time of this index. And all data sets are representative at district level in rural and urban areas. So the indicators are first the dimensions are exactly the same as for instance, the Human Development Index or the global MPI impact, in which we have a third of the weight for health, education, and living standards each. In the case of health, we see that they are measuring child mortality, where a child has passed away in the household, and food security, whether the household has a shortage of food. In terms of education, they assess school attendance of children in school age and schooling, whether any household member has completed 5 years of schooling. In terms of cooking fuel, whether they use solid cooking fuel, sanitation facility is not improved or shared, whether the household has electricity or does not have access to drinking water, or this drinking water is further away than more than 30 minutes by walk, counting the round trip. They also consider access to roads, whether the access to a road is further away than 30 minutes walk, whether the housing materials are not adequate in terms of floor, in terms of 2 of 3, floor, wall, and roof, whether the household has does not own more than one asset of radio, telephone, television, bike and motorbike, and refrigerator, whether the household does not have more than 1 acre of land, and whether the household does not have more than 3 of the following cattle, horses, sheep, goats, chicken, pigs, buffalo, or yaks. So I think this is a very different process of selecting indicators, but because in the Mexican case, I remember seeing the decision makers going through the constitutional rights, through the law of education, getting to know all the rights that every citizen had, whether they had a right to have a housing or not, this threshold of 1982, the law changing in terms of education. But if you remember with Sabina, in the decision making of these thresholds, poor people were called upon, and they saw that land was different, of different quality, would actually imply a different threshold in different communities, either in Donga or in other communities, and whether cattle has different quality as well. Some cattle is older or some other younger, and this has to be considered into the definition of poverty. The K cutoff is 4 over 13 indicators, or effectively 30.7 of the weighted dimensions, and there is a more intense cutoff of 7 out of 13, which is slightly more than the half of the indicators for a more intense poverty. And the MPI at national level is 0.051. We can also decompose by regions and contributions of each of the indicators. And we can also see, I'm sure that we have drawn upon this data before, that income poverty and multidimensional poverty are not the same. They are complementary. And they are different as well in each of the regions. So the high of the red bars shows multidimensional poverty, and the high of the blue bars show income poverty. They were able as well to show some sensitivity of the measure for different K cutoffs. And in terms of policy use, it has been used to allocate budget at local level and to setting the eradication target of reducing poverty below 10% before 2018. So now I leave the microphone to my colleague Monica, who will introduce the index in Colombia.
So I'm going to present the Colombian MPI. They didn't choose me to present this because I'm Colombian. No. That was not in the criteria selection. And then, Índice de Pobreza Multidimensional. It's like the name in Spanish. Yeah? So we didn't change it. It's an adaptation from the DPS, that is the department that produced this. So the starting point. So in Colombia, there is a tradition of calculating poverty measurements using income data. So this tradition has been since the 19th, and they were calculating this series. And then during the during the last decade, they realized that it was not possible to calculate the series again because they changed the surveys, or they changed different questions in the surveys. So the series were not comparable. So they have a poverty commission, and they were analyzing what to do. And one of the ideas was like, okay, we are going to try to homogenize this series in the best way, but we also are going to create a new measurement of poverty. All this with the aim, or with the main objective, of having a strategy to reduce poverty and inequality, and to improve the quality of life of people in Colombia. So they create this measurement of multidimensional poverty using the Alkier-Foster method. Yeah? So sorry? No? So one of the good things that this method has, or this measurement in Colombia has, is that it has been used not only to have a number of how many people is multidimensionally poor in the country, but also it has like key activities or key aspects. One is that it reflects the objective of the social policy. This means it's like when they select the dimensions and the indicators, those dimensions and indicators were selected aiming that it will be a good way to see if social policy have an effect on the lives of people. Another is that coordinates public policy sectors. I don't know if you remember the first day, Sabina mentioned that in Colombia the ministers meet the president 3 times in a year, and they have these committees. And they go there and they say, okay, we are doing this, and we are trying to tackle this deprivation in this way, and they all get into the same table and talk about policies that they are implementing in aiming to reduce deprivations in each of the indicators. So in that order, it helps to coordinate policies. So it's not only to implement things in a crazy way, but it's to implement it with the goal to reduce deprivation in that indicator. Another is that it helps to monitor public policies. If you think about the purpose of if the purpose of the measure is to improve the efficiency of public policies, and you select your indicators aiming to reflect that, it helps you to monitor it. So we are going to see in a few slides that it really helps to the President Santos to know what is improving and what is not in the country. And also even for decision making. So there is applications of this MPI, or the results of the MPI, in order to do geographic targeting. Program compositions of the CCTs depend in some extent of how the indicators are behaving. And also, it's a way to graduate from the CCTs, because one of the problems that we used to have is that people are in the conditional cash transfer forever. But with now, if you are not multidimensional poor and fulfill different criteria, now you exit the program because you don't need it. So I think Sabina has explained quite a lot the MPI in Colombia. But just a review, the MPI in Colombia has 5 dimensions: education, childhood and young conditions, labor, health, public utilities, and housing conditions. And it has 15 indicators. So we have the dimension like education that has schooling, illiteracy. We have the dimension of childhood and young, that is school attendance at the right level, being in the school but at the right level. So this is like if you are in a year that it doesn't correspond to your age group, you will be deprived. Access to infant services and no child labor. They have work, absence of long-term unemployment and formal work. We have health coverage and access to health care given the necessity. And we have housing and public services, that is improved water, sanitation, flooring, material the walls, and overcrowding. If you see, this indicator uses nested weights, meaning that each of the dimensions have the same weight, and indicators inside of each dimension have the same weight. Yeah? And it used the household as a unit of analysis. If you remember, Sabine explained why they took this decision. It was more an ethical decision. It was a normative decision, and also because most of the public policies in Colombia are aimed to reduce poverty at the household level. So they don't go to the person, they go to the household. So it was logic to have this as at the level of analysis. So we have in here that the criteria for select the variables was using 3 different things. First, it was how often they use these variables. Are these variables common in other indicators? What information are giving me these variables? Other is to make a literature review. So you go to the literature, you identify those variables that are more common. And it was something that Sabina showed, like this table with all the indicators and different indicators in different countries, and see how common these countries use. So this was one of the tools that they used. In that time, there was not this beautiful table that we have now, but it was something really similar, followed the same logic. And you discuss with experts. So you call people who really know about poverty and you talk, okay, if we are going to measure poverty from a multidimensional perspective, which dimensions and indicators should we use? Yeah? And also they use other indicators, they use examples, like they analyze the global MPI, the unsatisfied basic needs, the quality of life index, that was an index that was quite used in Colombia to measure quality of life. And this is when 2, 3, there is a targeting index that was created aiming to target and classify people as poor or not poor. And those who are poor will get access to the CCTs. So they analyze all these. And also they went to say, they analyze or they decide each of the dimension based on how you can affect it by public policies. So the objective of this index is that it will be a way to monitor policies, so you need to select your dimensions based on that. Just imagine if you have here the example that Sabina was giving, like how long are your fingernails? So which public policy are you going to do in that? You're not going to go and cut the nails of each of the individuals. So in here, what they did is that they include policies that will be include indicators that will be affected by the policies. And finally, it depends on the availability of data or the information, because they use already a survey that was existed. So they use the quality of life survey that was collected every 2-3 years in that time, and they needed to focus the information in there. And finally, they have a criteria to validate the variables, and is the coefficient of variation. So they decided that variables that have less than 50% of variation were good enough to include in the index. Okay. So as I was saying, the poverty cutoff was defined as the mean of the of the privations that those who consider income poor and subject to poverty say. So there is a question in the survey that say, compared to 3 years or 2 years ago, do you feel that you are poor? So they use that question in order to calculate this mean. And as Sabina said, they found out that people who were income poor, on average, was 5.2, deprived in 5.2 indicators, and those who were not income poor were deprived in 3.2. So they realized that this was almost comparable between those who perceive themselves as poor and those who are income poor. So they decided that poverty could have based it on that. So one of the important things in the MPI for Colombia is that it's really good for tracking poverty. So what they have in here is that they have monetary poverty or income poverty, extreme income poverty, and the multidimensional poverty index, the MPI, and they are tracking how much is reducing. So this tracking helped them to decide what to do in order to improve the number of people who are out of multidimensional poverty. So from 2010 to 2013, 1.3 million people overcame multidimensional poverty in Colombia. So how they did it? So they have these high official commissions that are the meetings of the president with the ministers. In here we have John Hammock. And he was invited to one of these commissions where the decisions are taken. So the president sits with the ministers and starts asking for what is happening, why is not moving the multidimensional poverty, what can we do? So they have these, that it's like traffic lines, and it depends on how much the indicator is moving and how good it's behaving. They have red, yellow, or green. So those who are green are those who are good. Those who are red are those who we have problems. So if you have, for example, long-term unemployment, they have the baseline that is 2008, and it started in 9.6%. They have in 2011, 9.1, but in 2012, there was 10%. So in this case, what they figured out is like the long-term employment is increasing. So we need to do something. We need to implement a policy or a strategy to reduce long-term employment, yeah? And that happened, for example, with the access to water resources. So it started in 12.9 levels of deprivation, then in 2011 it was 12%, and in 2012 it was 10.3, and the goal was 10.9. So remember that they set goals, and as Sabina was mentioning on Monday, the President Santos has been the only president that said, okay, from here to 2014, we're going to reduce multidimensional poverty in this level to this percentage, and we're going to reduce the deprivation in each of the indicators. So that was the goal. So they meet and they analyze this movement of the indicators, and they decided their policies based on that. So we have in here, in 2010, there was alerts about school achievement, early childhood care, income generation, habitability. And what they say is like, okay, we are going to implement policies from 2010 to 2011, and we are going to give free tuition fees in primary and secondary education in order that it will improve school achievement, yeah? And they say, okay, we are having a strategy for childhood care that is the cero a siempre. So they were going to improve early childhood care, yeah? And then in 2011, they have again the alert of habitability, and they realized that there was the multidimensional poverty index was not moving really fast. So the goal was not going to be achievable if they keep like that. So what they say is like, okay, we have problems with habitability, and in 2010 we have as well, so we need to do something about that. So we are going to give 100,000 free housing solution for poor people. And in that case, in that order, they improve the housing of the individuals. In 2011, they have the alert that still income poverty was not moving, and there was gaps between rural and urban areas. So they have the strategy that it was more families in action, that is the CCT program that Colombia has, and they were based or they were more focused on rural areas. So in this way, they track the poverty and they say, okay, this is the goal, and we're going to improve or reduce the deprivation levels according to how they analyze each of the indicators and how the indicators move over time. And here, okay, we have another. Another way that they use the MPI, or the results of the MPI, is how to distribute the CCTs. So before the MPI, they gave the CCTs according to other criteria. Usually the CISBEN 3, that is the targeting index that they used to have. So what they realized is that in this map, you see how is the initial distribution of beneficiaries in the CCTs. So those who are green are those who have less than 10%, and those who are red are those who have more than 45%. So one of the areas that is the poorest areas in Colombia is Chocó, that is this area in here. And if you realize, most of the area is green, so they were not receiving CCTs. But if you see the other map, that's one of the areas that is the poorest, multidimensional poor, because it's red. Yeah? So what they realize is that they are not matching that. So they are giving subsidies to people who don't need, and those who are in really high levels, or those regions with high levels of multidimensional poverty were not receiving. So then they decided that they were going to do a new distribution of those who will benefit from the CCTs, and we have this map. So now we pass from being completely green or mostly green to have a more orange and red areas, meaning that in areas that are quite poor, or they are really poor, they are receiving more subsidies and they are receiving more CCTs, so the policies will be more effective and we are going to have more results. So if you see, the purpose of the measure was to improve social policies, was to have an effect in social policy. And most of the decisions, the normative decisions, were based in that, were based with the aim to reduce multidimensional poverty and improve or include indicators that will be affected by social policy. And in here, what they are doing is like, we have the CCTs, that is the strategy that we have to reduce poverty. We use the MPI to focus, to targeting or CCTs, and in that order of ideas, fulfill their process or purpose. Now I give the word to Adriana.
Okay, and now I'm going to present the case of Pakistan, which is a new national multidimensional poverty index. It was launched in June, the 20th of June in Islamabad, and so it's a very recent case that we have been working with for the last couple of years with Sabina, Chris also worked on this, and a few other people in the team. So basically, in the case of Pakistan, in a similar note to what happened in Colombia, there was also first a national development plan that led to the creation of the MPI, but it was a bit of a different context. In the case of Pakistan, they launched in 2014 what their own national development plan, which is called Vision 2025. And in there, they discussed the need for economic growth to happen in a very sustainable and inclusive way, and therefore they already discussed the need to incorporate multidimensional poverty measures so that they will have a more complete and comprehensive understanding on what poverty is in the context of Pakistan. At the same time, they wanted to have an MPI to use as a tool for governance that would allow them to track the different, what they call pillars of this development plan, or the different objectives that they were trying to reach by 2025. And so they thought that the MPI would provide them with the perfect tool to try to track and monitor the progress that was being done in the different pillars of the development plan. And at the same time, they thought it would be good for them to monitor their achievement of the different SDGs included in the newly launched agenda by the UN last year. So basically, there were different actors that were involved in the process of the MPI in the case of Pakistan, like they are mentioned here. And basically, our main counterparts counterparts while working there were people from the Planning Commission in Pakistan that are the ones in charge of poverty computations and also the management of all the social programs in the country. And also UNDP, which provided financial support, but also they were involved in the computations and in putting together public consultations and different discussion groups in the different provinces of the country to validate and to discuss all the different normative decisions that are being made. So the selection of dimensions and indicators, the cutoffs, the K-value, all of these decisions were firstly discussed within the Planning Commission, but then they were checked with experts in each of the relevant ministries, like the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Labor. And then after that, they were validated through these public consultations with experts from different provinces, and then also people from UNICEF, UNDP, the World Bank, and different international agencies were also invited to participate and to give their opinion, as well as academic and people from the academia in Pakistan and international experts. So it was quite a comprehensive process that they went through to be able to have a measure that was as sound as possible, at least in the normative justification of the different dimensions, the different decisions that were being made. In the particular case of this measure, they are using the three same dimensions that we have for the global MPI: education, health, and living standards. But the set of indicators have been tailored to the national context in Pakistan. So instead of having the 10 indicators that we have for the global MPI, they are using a set of 15. And even for those indicators that are the same as those in the global MPI, they have tailored it using particular cutoffs that were relevant for their own context. So in the case of education, they are using three indicators: years of schooling, school attendance for children, and educational quality. In the case of years of schooling, like Sabina was mentioning in one of her sessions today, they were particularly interested in trying to understand the gender gap in access to schooling, which in the case of Pakistan is a real concern. So they decided that they wouldn't just create a measure of years of schooling like the one we have for the global MPI, which basically asks for at least one member in the household that has completed 5 years of schooling. They wanted to have both at least one man but also one woman that had completed 5 years of schooling. So if there is no man and no woman in a household, the household is deprived. But they use information for both genders separately so that they are able to, in a way, capture this disparity by genders that exist in Pakistan in access to education. In the case of child school attendance, the indicator is very similar to the ones we were discussing before, but specifically tailored to the compulsory years of education in the case of Pakistan. In Pakistan, only primary school is compulsory, and that's between 6 and 11 years. So they are only asking children within that age group to be going to school. And again, if any child in the household is not going, then the household is considered to be deprived in school attendance. And then they added this new indicator on educational quality, which is something new that they created based on their own household survey in the country, which is basically they are considering whether the child, if the child is not attending school, whether that it's because there is no school close by, or because there is no, because the professors or the teachers are not good, because there are no books or other school material, or because there is no female or male teachers that could be providing the service, or if for those children that are attending school, they ask whether they are satisfied with the service or not. So it has a bit of a subjective component within this indicator. And as you can see, the indicators, well, I'm going to mention that in a second. I'd rather just finish with the list of indicators first. Then in the case of health, they have 4 different indicators, which are completely different from the list of the global MPI, basically because the household survey in Pakistan doesn't have information on child mortality or in nutrition. So they created 4 different indicators. The first one is on access to clinic in case of need, and basically a household is considered to be deprived if they don't have access to a clinic or they have very infrequent access when they need it, and that is due because there is no clinic that is close by, because there are no doctors available, or because there is no female or male doctors, and so on. And then for particular population groups, which are usually women or women that have given birth in recent years, they have 3 additional indicators. One that has to do with whether children under 5 have a complete calendar of vaccinations that has been given to them. Also, if women that have given birth in the last 3 years had received antenatal care. And the final one is, again, for these women that have given birth in the 3 years previous to the survey, whether or not they were assisted by a trained personnel, by a trained doctor or nurse when they were giving birth to their babies.
This depends about detail about the weight.
Yes, I'll come back to that in a second. And then the third dimension is the living standard dimension, and here they are using 8 different indicators. There are a few of them that are very similar to the ones that were used for the global MPI, like the one for floor and electricity, sanitation, and water, but then they are adding here overcrowding, which is something that was particularly relevant for urban areas in Pakistan. They also changed a bit the cutoff for the indicator on assets, and they added this indicator on land and livestock, which is particularly important, of course, for rural areas in the country. But then they decided that this was an indicator that they were only going to require households to have a particular amount of land and animals if they were in rural areas. So urban households are considered to be automatically non-deprived in this indicator. Now, going back to the weights, all 3 dimensions are weighted equally, so each dimension receives 1/3 of the weight. But as you can see in the last column of the table, not all indicators are weighted equally. And this has to do with something that I was mentioning before for the case of Colombia. In the particular case of health, for example, which is a very clear example, as I was mentioning before, these 3 indicators here, immunization, antenatal care, and assisted delivery, are very particular for a subpopulation group. Only children under 5 or only women that have given birth 3 years prior to the survey are going to be replying or are going to be relevant for these particular questions. And that means that a big chunk of the population is actually not applicable for these questions. And so that's why they decided to give these questions or these indicators a much lower weight. If you take a look, they are actually receiving the same weight altogether than just this one indicator on access to clinic. Then something similar happened with the other indicators in the case of education. This indicator on educational quality, it has a subjective component. And so they didn't want, and subjective questions are very interesting, but they are not always that reliable. And in many cases, the scales, the individual scales to determine whether you are satisfied or not might be changing a lot from one person or one group or one city to the next. And also they are not constant over time. So because they wanted to avoid problems of including this kind of subjective question into the indicator, they decided to keep it, but with a much lower weight. And then something similar here, as I was mentioning, overcrowding and the quality of walls are indicators that are particularly relevant in urban areas. And so they decided to give half of the weight to each of those indicators, so that it would compensate in a way the fact that they were not as relevant for other areas of the country. Well, in the case of this MPI, they decided to, as in the previous cases that we were presenting before, to keep the unit of identification at the household level. And this has a lot to do with the limitations with the data that exists so far. Every country that we have worked with and every country that we're working with would like to have a measure that has the individual as a unit of identification and analysis. But unfortunately, in many cases, we don't have information. We don't have all the indicators that would be relevant for each individual in a household, and that's why they usually take it to the household level, even though then they analyze it at the individual level. So again, in the case of Pakistan, this is what they are doing. In the case of, in terms of the K value that they decided to use, again, because they are using 3 dimensions that are equally weighted, they decided that they wanted to have the basic K value, the one that would identify people as being multidimensionally poor or not, equal to 1/3. So basically, you need to be deprived in what would constitute a whole dimension to be considered to be multidimensionally poor, or a combination of indicators from different dimensions that would eventually lead to being deprived at least 1/3 of the indicators. But then they are also using a second cutoff, or a second poverty line, which is to identify people that are living in extreme poverty, and that's when households are suffering from deprivations in half of the weighted indicators or more. So if households are deprived in 50% or more of the weighted indicators, they are considered to be extremely poor. The household survey that is being used in the case of the official MPI in Pakistan is the PSLM, which is a survey that has been conducted since 2004, and it's done every year, but it's 1 year it's representative at the provincial level, every other year it's representative at the provincial level, and the other year it's representative at the district level, so with an even greater representativity at for a greater disaggregation. So the one that has been used for the national MPI is the one that actually allows the country to get down to the district level, to get even more precise information and be able to capture very well regional disparities within the country. So this is the most basic results the initial results that they got, and these are the uncensored headcount ratios for each of the 15 indicators that they included in the measure. As you can see here, the indicator that is showing the largest ratio is the indicator on cooking fuel. And then it's also followed by years of schooling and overcrowding and assets that are also quite high. Again, this is just the proportion of people who is deprived in each of the indicators, regardless of regardless of whether or not they are poor. So when I'm saying here that nearly 60% of the population is deprived in cooking fuel, that means that that's over the whole population. They are not necessarily MPI poor. They are just deprived in this particular indicator. And we're going to see how this changes when we are actually moved to the censored headcounts, but all of these figures are going to drop. In terms of the MPI H and A, these are the results that they get for 2014 and 15. Basically, they have that nearly 40% of the population, 39% of the population is identified as being deprived in 1/3 or more of the weighted indicators, and the MPI is 0.197 in this particular year that we are considering, and the intensity of poverty is nearly 51%. That means that those almost 40% of poor people in Pakistan are deprived on average in 51% or more than half of the indicators that are included into the MPI. Now, this is in a way to get a sense of how figures are very different when we consider regional estimates. Pakistan is a country that is characterized by by huge disparities by areas, urban and rural areas, but also by regions within the country. So as you can see at the national level, you're always going to see that rural areas have a much higher MPI, and they also have a much higher headcount of poverty than urban areas. And that is something that we see at the national level, but also similar trends are found for each of the different provinces in the country. In particular, at the national level, we find that, for example, less than 10% of the population that lives in urban areas is multidimensionally poor, while the proportion of people living in poverty in rural areas is around 55%. So it goes from 10% to 55% at the national level. And then similar gaps are found for each of the provinces in the country. As you can see here, Balochistan is the province in the country with the highest MPI, and it's also the province in the country with the highest headcount of multidimensional poverty and the highest intensity of poverty. And it's interesting to know that in that particular province, they only concentrate 5% of the total population of the country. But out of that 5% of the 180 million people that live in Pakistan, around 75% of them are multidimensionally poor. Punjab, that it's one of the least poor provinces in the country, both by MPI and incidence of poverty, they concentrate 60% of the total population of the country, but they are the least poor. So in a way, it seems that it's very polarized in terms of the country. This is the percentage contribution of each of the indicators to the national or the total poverty, the MPI, for the country and for urban and rural areas. As you can see, the indicator that contributes the most to the MPI is years of schooling. And this is mostly driven because of the fact that women are not going, they haven't completed 5 years of schooling. At one previous stage of this MPI, when we were still considering how to combine indicators and what would be the best indicators to include into the measure, they had 2 different indicators on years of schooling, one for men and one for women separately. And the one that was really contributing to the MPI was the lack of years of schooling for women. So basically there is such a huge disparity. The proportion of women that haven't completed 5 years of schooling is so large in Pakistan that that's contributing very, very highly to the global MPI, to the overall MPI. The other indicators that are contributing quite a lot, as you can see, this pink color over there is access to health facilities, and then also this orange color over there is child school attendance. Overall education, it's contributing to nearly 30% to overall MPI at the national level. And then the other dimensions are contributing a bit more. So living standards contribute around 35% and something like that. In the case of urban areas, like you can see the second column here in the graph, education, the trends are relatively similar. So we still have years of schooling, school attendance, and access to health facilities as being the main drivers of overall MPI in these areas. But as you can see, in urban areas, education as a whole, the dimension as a whole, is contributing much, much more to the MPI than at the national level. In particular, it's contributing 47%. So almost half of the MPI is coming from deprivations in education. Okay, and because of the fact that the PSLM has been conducted since 2004 and the questionnaire has been kept the same as well as the sample design, we are able to compute the whole trend, to create a whole trend to analyze what has been happening and to monitor poverty trends in the past decade in Pakistan and in each of the provinces in the country. Basically, what the results are showing here is that both that the different components, H, A, and also the MPI have been dropping, or they have dropped between 2004 and 2015. In the case of H, the reduction has been quite significant, as you can see in the second bar graph over there, or here as well. Basically, it has dropped from 55% to 39% in a decade. And then the intensity of poverty has also decreased statistically significantly, though it hasn't been such a large reduction. It went from 53% to 51%. It's still significant, but it's not very large in absolute terms. And so basically what this means is that the large reduction that we see in the MPI in the case of Pakistan has been mostly driven by a reduction in the number of poor, or the proportion of people that are identified as multidimensionally poor in the country. The same trend is found both in urban and rural areas and also in the different provinces of the country. The MPI has always been falling gradually every 2 years that we are analyzing with the data. The changes were always statistically significant for H and the MPI. And A had been showing a more erratic behavior, but then at the end of the year, when we compare beginning and end of the period under analysis, the whole decade, we always see that A has been has reduced in this decade in every area and every province. Now, as I was mentioning before, in the case of Pakistan, the interesting thing about this survey is that we are also able to get figures at the district level, which provides a very rich picture for, and very useful picture for policy in any country. So in this graph, what we are showing in the horizontal axis is the initial MPI, or the level of the MPI in 2004. And so basically those districts that are closest to zero are the districts that were showing a lower MPI in 2004, like Islamabad, Karachi, and Lahore. And those countries that are further to the right are the ones that were showing the highest levels of the MPI in 2004. And then in the vertical axis, what we are what we are showing here is the absolute change in the MPI between 2004 and 2015. So districts that are further down in the graph are the ones that have experienced the largest reductions in the MPI in absolute terms. And those that are above the zero are the ones that have shown increases in the values of their MPIs. So basically, what would be the ideal trend that we would observe in this graph? What would we want to find? What would be a successful policy outcome, basically? We would want that those districts that have the largest values of the MPI would have been the ones showing the largest absolute reductions, right? So, for example, Islamabad, Lahore, Karachi, that are concentrated here, very close to the zero, they have very low levels of poverty to begin with. So, of course, they are not going to show a very large reduction because they were already quite low. So what we would expect to find is that for those districts that were all the way to the right, that were showing very, very large levels of the MPI, they would show very large reductions. If very good, very well-targeted poverty programs had been implemented, we would expect to find that those were the districts in which we would observe, or we would find, the largest reductions of the MPI in absolute terms. And in a way, we do find a bit of that. We do find that a whole chunk of, a whole chunk of districts over there that are showing a very large reduction in absolute terms in the MPI, and that had very, very large levels of, very high levels of the MPI at the beginning of the period that we are analyzing here. So it seems to have a pro-poor trend. However, there are some districts that have medium level or even high levels of MPI in 2004 that are either very close to zero or even above zero. And we actually analyzed whether these changes were statistically significant or not. And we found that, unfortunately, for those that are over there at the top, they are statistically significant. So it means that even being very, very poor at the beginning, those districts increase their poverty levels even more. Their MPI increased even more in the past decade. So it's very unfortunate because it seems that the programs were not able to really catch or reach all of the poorest districts. But in a way, it's still kind of a positive story. It still has a pro-poor trend in general terms, and many very poor districts were able to reduce poverty in a very fast way. Okay, and here just to show you a bit more of information, this is the incidence of poverty in 2004, so the initial proportion of people identified as multidimensionally poor in each district of Pakistan in 2004. And we go from the darkest red for the districts that are the poorest. And then it goes to light red, blues, and greens. So those that are showing green over here, this is Islamabad. That's why it's the only one in green. And then blues are the ones that are in a medium level of poverty, and red is really, really poor. And look how the picture changes when we create the same map for 2015. just the proportion of red, the scale has been kept the same so that we could compare directly the colors, right? So as you can see, there is still a lot of red. There are still a lot of pockets of poverty, but at the same time, we have a lot of light red and we have a lot of blue that didn't exist before, and we have a lot of green that it wasn't there before either. So as you can see, maps sometimes are very good tools to show in an instant to show progress. Like, let's think how long we spent explaining this graph and how easy it was to compare one year with the other when we have the maps, right? So basically this presentation, the idea of this kind of presentation to the global MPI, the national MPI, is to show particular uses of the methodology, the Aguilar-Foster methodology. You're going to be using this to create your own MPIs with your own working groups starting tomorrow. And so you're going to have to make all of these decisions. But then we also want to use these opportunities to show different ways in which you can show results, different graphs, different figures, different creating a map. Because this is something important, not just to create your figures and to compute numbers, but to also be able to communicate them. Especially for those of you that work for government agencies or for international organizations, it's very important to be able to communicate as much as to compute. Okay, and so basically, just to sum up a little bit, we have been going through different MPIs, different national measures, Colombia, Bhutan, Mexico, Pakistan, different regions of the world, and different uses of the measure, different actors that were involved. But there are particular things that have been kept constant. There are other countries that we have been working with that we could have presented, but we didn't want to have this to be too long, and just to provide different examples of different things that have been done. But in the but basically all of our work with countries, we work a lot with different countries and increasingly more, and a lot of the countries that we're working with are part of a network, the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network, the MPPN. And in the MPPN website, we have all the information of the different national MPIs that exist out there for Chile and for Costa Rica, Ecuador, El Salvador, what else? Tunisia, Malaysia, Ho Chi Minh City, Minas Gerais, in Brazil, I don't know what else, but well, a whole bunch of countries, and and so there is a lot more information. But just here, we just wanted to provide you with different alternatives and different normative decisions that how different countries come around to make these normative decisions that we are going to be doing with your groups tomorrow. So basically, there are a few things that have been kept, that have remained constant. We know this example, always using the Aguilar-Foster method. They all use the household as the level of, as the unit of identification. As I was mentioning before, it has a lot to do with the data that is available in the countries and the lack of information at the individual level for a lot of these dimensions. Also, besides computing at the national level, one of the main drivers for governments that decide to create a national measure is to be able to get information disaggregated by different subnational regions. And not just by regions, but in many countries they want to also disaggregate by countries, by ethnic groups. Colombia has created a whole MPI for indigenous groups in the country. And so particular for different gender, for different age groups, and so for different groups that are relevant to each particular country, as well as urban and rural regions and districts and all of that. Some of the countries present all of the information, the age, A, and the MPI, but there are countries that just present the age or the incidence of multidimensional poverty rather than going all the way through and computing the MPI. And the uses for policy has been also very varied. They have been using it for targeting or for monitor programs or for coordination of different policies. So it's a bit, it depends a lot of the particular purpose for which the measure is intended. Now, we have also included this in the presentation, which basically tries to put it very briefly, what has been the main driver of each of these decisions, whether it was the constitution, a development plan, participatory processes, and how these normative decisions were made in each of the countries. And so this is also here for you to take a look. And so I know that we are a bit behind today. I have a few additional slides to go over, and I'm going to do it as fast and brief as I can. But here we have a few slides on what are the basic steps that are usually needed to create a national MPI or to create your own MPI. And you're going to be working, in part, you're going to be working on this when you are creating your own MPI in the next few days. But a lot of this stuff is actually something that would take a lot of times, and that with governments we work for months to get or years in some cases. And in El Salvador we work for 5 years before having the final measure. So of course, and here you're going to have a whole week. So almost the same. So well, basically, it's important to know that there are a few steps that you're going to need to be going over. And here you're going to have maybe an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes for each of these steps. But then if you ever work in really creating an MPI, but not just an MPI, if you want to work on any kind of a targeting tool, or if you want to create, I don't know, a child poverty or a women empowerment index that has been done also with the Alkire-Foster method, these are decisions that are usually needed and steps that are usually needed in order to have a final index that is robust and useful. Basically, it's important to know that there are different actors that are going to be involved. It's not just one particular group of people. It usually involves people at the very high political level, like a minister, the president, or secretaries of different ministries, the head of the Institute of Statistics. But it also includes a lot of technicians, a lot of statisticians. It includes a lot of people from the civil society, like citizens that are involved in the discussions and in participatory processes. It could also include experts or academics in different countries that are invited to be part of the process. And so it is good to have all these actors getting involved and weighing in and making sure that the measure has been validated. But at the same time, it's important to know that with more actors getting involved, the measure, of course, gets more complex. The process gets more complex. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Now, in general, what we have seen is that the way this has worked has been different for different countries. In the case of Colombia, and this is a bit of an anecdote, one of of the OFI members who is not here, he's based in Chile, he was just traveling on holidays, and he got an upgrade, and he ended up sitting in a plane next to President Uribe from Colombia. And he said, okay, I have my chance. I'm going to pitch the MPI and see what happens. And the guy liked it. Uribe liked it. And so he went back home and he told the Minister of Development, hey, you know what? I like this thing. I think we should do it. And that's how it all started. In other countries, it's people like you that have come to the summer school that say, hey, you know what? When I go back to my work at the Ministry of Planning or Social Development or the Institute of Statistics, I'm going to go and talk to my boss and tell them about this measure that I think could be useful. And so it all started from a technician or from a technical team that computing some preliminary measure and show it to someone higher in the hierarchy that decided, okay, this actually is useful. And in other case, it was maybe, I don't know, a minister that in some meeting met a minister from a different country and heard that they were using this and it was useful to track progress in indicators that usually respond much quicker than income. And so they said, that could actually be very useful to track the progress of all the effort, all the programs that I have been implementing. So it has come in different ways, but usually it implies what we usually see in place is a technical team or a technical committee of people that are working in the computation, the data crunching part of the process, and then a political group or some kind of validation committee or something like that. There are ministers or secretaries or even people from poverty commissions that are created ad hoc to create an MPI, like in the case of Chile, for example. And so usually these two groups have to exchange a lot, have to learn a lot and discuss a lot with each other, and the process is not just one way. It takes several rounds. So basically you compute a measure, you present it, they send it back with comments and suggestions and requests and demands that you change particular things, and you send it back, and they send it back again, and after a few iterations you have an MPI. But it's not usually, it's not an academic exercise, So it's going to be bound and restricted by a lot of very practical restrictions when you're trying to create a national measure, as you can imagine. So the first thing is actually to have a normative understanding or all this set of normative decisions that are already going to be made. So usually what happens is that somebody has already decided on a purpose, like I want to track poverty, I want to be able to target the poorest of the poor, I want to be able to be able to really understand what are the regional disparities in the country. I want to see if the beneficiaries, if my particular conditional cash transfer program is being correctly allocated to the poorest districts of the country, like the example that Monica was presenting before. So the purpose usually just is it comes to us once we start working with any particular country. And similarly, the first thing that you have to do is look for the normative basis for all the other decisions. For example, is there a constitution that is already mentioning which are the dimensions or the indicators, like in the case of Mexico? Is there a national plan? Is there legislation that already says, for example, that schooling is mandatory for all school-age children or for primary school? Is there already a law that says that children should not be working until the age of 18? So there, you should take all of those elements already and you can use them to make these normative decisions. Or for example, in the case of the MDGs, or the now renamed SDGs, those already provide some kind of international standard for many indicators that are considered to be relevant for every country in the world, like sanitation, water, now all these green indicators that we are adding into our analysis. So all of these kind of already indicators that already have some international consensus can also serve as a base, as a basis for all our normative decisions, just as much as local or national development plans. So basically, once you have done that, once you have already decided on, okay, this is what I'm going to do, this is the purpose of why I'm going to create this measure, and this is going to be the main normative basis for all my work with this measure, the next thing is to, there are going to be like 3 main steps. The first one is to try to see, okay, which is going to be your survey or your data source, your survey instrument. Are you going to use an existing household survey? Are you going to create a new one from scratch? Are you going to modify one that exists by adding a new module or new dimensions or adjusting the questions? That's another decision. And again, it's usually not the technicians on their own that can decide on something like this, because as many of you might know, adding a question into a survey costs a lot, especially if you say, oh, why don't we add anthropometrics? That's a huge amount of budget that goes into that. So these are not minor questions, and these are things that are really going to impact the kind of MPI that you can create. Based on the survey that you're going to be using, you're going to have to see which are the indicators that are actually available, which are the indicators that you want, that you are available to create based on the data that is there. So for example, if you tell me, no, I want to create a survey from scratch, then you can decide first normatively which are all the indicators that you want to include in your measure, and then design a survey that is going to include all of that information. But as I was mentioning for the case of Colombia, they really wanted to have labor within their MPI. They really wanted to have employment indicators within the MPI, but they were not able to change their survey. And so they said, okay, what are the indicators that we are able to do? We are able to create based on the existing data. And they have to settle for the indicators that were there already, or that were possible to be created based on the existing data. So then once you have analyzed all the possible indicators that you can create, you have to start creating candidate MPIs, what we call candidate or trial MPIs, basically combining all these different indicators. For example, in the global MPI, we didn't just come up with this 3 dimensions 10 indicator index. Rather, what happened is that we created 8 different MPIs. We sent it to the UN Statistical Commission. They sent it back with comments. We created 5 more and sent it to them. They sent it back with comments. We created 3 more. They sent back comments, and then we came up with the final MPI. So this iteration was long, and there were many MPIs that were created before we arrived to this final version of the MPI with a lot of consensus and a lot of discussion. And so that will be the second step over here. And then this, and part of that is also the analyzing the trial measure. What does it mean in terms of policy? Disaggregate it, present figures by regions, by areas, by different groups in the country, and compare that with other existing evidence that you have for your country and see if it makes sense or not, if it's robust or not. So I'm going to try to go through these steps very briefly, and you have more information on this in the slides if you want to go deeper. And we can discuss it further in the next few days, but I don't want to take a lot of your time given that we are already behind schedule. But basically, I'm going to go through these steps quite briefly. The first one, like I said, is to explore the potential indicators in whatever data source you have decided to use for your potential MPI, for your national measure or the measure that you have decided to create. And what we usually try to do based on this exercise is to create what we call the universe of indicators. Basically put them all together and say, okay, for example, for the dimension on education, I want to create an indicator on literacy. So what are the options? Well, I can create an indicator on whether the person knows how to read, another one about whether the person knows how to write, another one about whether the person knows how to read and write, and another one about whether the person knows how to read or write. So we can create 4 different indicators for just literacy. Years of schooling. And we say, okay, we need at least one member in the household that has completed 5 years of schooling. There are so many different things that we can play around. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years of schooling, 10 years, 12 years of schooling. We can also do it by levels, primary school, secondary school, university, and that's just changing the threshold. But then we can also change the unit. We are saying at least one individual that has done it, but we can also go the other extreme and say that all adults should have completed primary school. Or we can say that at least 50% should have completed. Or like in the case of Pakistan, that at least a man and a woman must have completed to be non-deprived. So all these combinations need to be tested in this initial stage so that we are sure that we are picking the indicator that it's the best possible indicator, but also that our decision on the indicator is robust. And that means that if I change this decision by a little bit, the indicator should not change dramatically. If not, my indicator is going to be very dependent on the particular sample that I'm using at that particular moment, and I don't want that. I want an indicator that is very sound, very robust, and that it's going to work well for different years when I keep updating the measure. So that's the first thing, to create this universe of indicators that it's going to be like what we were discussing before, like you did in your matrix in the paper-based exercise, that it's a binary indicator, 0 for undeprived and 1 for deprived. And you do that with all the possible combinations and all the possible thresholds and all the possible units, and you create this Excel file with all of that information and with the preliminary incidence of deprivation for each of them. So that's the first thing. And then you also include what's the applicable population, what are the missing values for each of these indicators, and all of that kind of information that it's very relevant at this stage. So that would be the first thing. This is just an example of particular indicators that we looked at when we were discussing Pakistan. And this is just a few that we looked at. This was actually like 3 or 4 times larger than this. And we combined so many different things together to get to the final list of 15 indicators. Something very important is to understand what's the applicable population, like I was saying before. So for example, if we are discussing about an indicator on vaccinations or antenatal care or assisted delivery, like the ones we were discussing for Pakistan, they are not applicable to the whole population, but just for children or just for women that have given birth very recently. And it's important to keep that in mind, because that means that a lot of the population are not going to be relevant, or for a big part of the population, those indicators are not going to be relevant to determine their poverty status or not. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. And this is the kind, it's teeny tiny, and the idea is not for you to be able to see it. It's just to give you an example, but this is what we would do. So we will have all of this information with very different populations that we are analyzing. For example, here for nutrition, we have children below 5, pregnant women, elderly, pregnant and elderly, adding all of these together. And so we put different combinations of things, and we add all of these columns and analyzing exactly like what's the proportion of individuals, what's the proportion of households, what are the missing values, and we try to understand all of that. We look at the coefficient of variation of all of these indicators. We compute the correlation between the different indicators, the redundancy between the different indicators, the association. All of that is something that you need to do to be able to know which are the indicators that you're going to include into your final measure. And we're going to go deeper into this, and we're going to show you how to compute a lot of these measures when you are working with them. And that's why I don't want to stop here for a long time. These are just a few examples on that. And then, like I said, it's based on that, when you have that whole universe of indicators, there are going to be a few indicators that behave very badly. So, for example, they are very redundant with other indicators, and you decide that it doesn't make sense to keep them for normative issues, or they have a very large proportion of missing values, or they are only relevant for a very small proportion of the population. And so you decide not to keep them, and you're going to stay with a final list of still very long list of indicators that you could potentially use. And you're going to start combining them and applying weights to create potential MPIs. So that's the next step. And like I was saying, there's going to be different ways in which you can decide how to pick these indicators and how to change the cutoffs and how to set the weights and how to choose the K value. And it can come again for the participatory process from and consultations from experts, from legislation. There are different ways in which you can inform yourself when you're doing this, but also from the technical considerations that we were discussing before, like in the case of Colombia or Pakistan, that they decided to give lower weight to particular indicators that were not applicable to the whole population, and so on. Okay, and then finally, the final step that you're going to do when you have computed the MPI is to disaggregate by gender, by age group, by regions, prepare maps, prepare graphs, all the complementary indices like the contributions, the uncensored headcounts, and the censored headcount ratios. And you're going to present all of that, and you're going to compare that with existing estimates that you already have from other sources and from knowledge. You already know that this particular region in my country is much poorer than this other, but my results are giving me something weird. So you go and you check again, and you see what could be the source of that disparity, whether it makes sense based on the information you are adding into the MPI, or whether it's something that is actually not very accurate and you need to go back and change it. And then you're going to present it to this policy committee or this political team that I was mentioning before, and they're going to criticize it, and they are going to provide comments and suggestions, and you're going to go back and redo it several times. The whole computational part of it, it doesn't take all that long. Making the normative decisions and getting an agreement, a consensus on all of this takes much, much longer. But writing the code, you're going to see it doesn't take all that long. You're going to do it in just a few days. And you're going to be able to just take the same code and redo it every time you want. And you can change the weights and rerun it in 20 minutes. That's not going to be the problem. The time-consuming part of this whole process is actually the normative decisions. And that's why it's going to be very important to think about it through, especially when you are working on a real-life situation. Okay, so and then the final point here is like something that I was mentioning before as well, that it's very important to communicate throughout the process, because this is something that we've also witnessed. Countries in which somebody took the whole process into their shoulders, and they decided to compute the whole MPI, they put it together, they make a presentation, and they went to the minister and said, look what I've done. And the minister said, I don't know what that is, I don't understand it, I don't understand why you have done something like this without checking with me before. Go back to the very beginning. We're going to start from scratch. So you need to communicate the whole process. Or for example, you want to launch an MPI without making the press, the media, to familiarize them with the terminology. They already know what is the proportion of poor people with the more traditional monetary figures. But now you're presenting something different, and now there are going to be 2 different poverty measures, and they are giving me very different results, and I don't understand it. So it's very important to be clear with all the different actors that are part of the process. So with the different levels within the government, with the academia, with the press, with the ministries, within the technical team, but also with the political team. All of these channels of communications need to be open and very, very clear and transparent without the whole process, or it becomes really messy then to understand and to remember how these decisions were made.